rumors were raging that the Confederates had crossed into Pennsylvania and were on their way here. The war had already been raging for 2 long years, and Carlisle had already suffered more than its share of casualties. Now their homes, businesses, and lives were in peril, and absolutely nothing was for certain. The stories you will see and hear today are for the most part 100% accurate. The names have not been changed. These are the stories as told by the participants themselves in newspaper accounts, letters, and diaries. The names you hear today may even sound familiar to you. Their descendants still live in the area, and maybe your neighbor, your classmate, or maybe, just maybe, you yourself. I first heard the story of Polly McGinnis shortly after I moved to Carlisle some 16 years ago. It's a great story about a woman who stands brave and true in the face of an approaching rebel invasion, and in the process inspires the men and women around her. Well, there are similarities between her and Carlisle's other famous heroine, Molly Pitcher. I can assure you, they're not the same person. Different wars, different century. But recently, however, as we began to do research for this event, we began to look deeper into the question of exactly who was Polly McGinnis. According to the story, Polly McGinnis was in her home when a man went running by, urging everyone to retreat while they could because the rebels were coming. She ran out the door and confronted him, stopped him dead in his tracks, and said, "Retreat? Never! Carlisle shall hold her own." And by all accounts, Polly McGinnis, at this point in life, in 1860, is an unmarried, red-headed Irish woman. She's got an opinion, you're going to know about it. So now, and unafraid to speak or remind anyone, she is well known throughout the town as maybe just a bit of a firebrand. You don't mess with a red-headed Irish woman. The redhead means something. But determined at this point to convince General William Baldy Smith that he and his troops from New York had to stay and defend the town, Polly made her way up to the old courthouse, where every important man in town was giving General Smith his opinion, and they didn't agree on exactly what should be done. Polly McGinnis walked up and poured a cup of coffee from an old coffee pot that had been in her family for generations. As she explained, "This coffee's from a pot that pours strength and courage too. And these, I sadly fear, are needed now by you." General Smith takes the cup and drinks it down in one gulp. Decision made, he says, "You're right, we'll hold this town." It's a great story, but I had to ask myself exactly how much was true and how much was a figment of somebody's imagination. That's where the research began. I began it looking at the United States Federal Census records. In 1860 in Carlisle, there's just one McGinnis family, consisting of Mary, Jane, John, Martha, and Charlotte McGinnis. In 1870, the census showed that the family was still here, but consisted only of Mary, Ann, Jane, and Charlotte. John and Martha were both gone, and Ann had arrived. Looking back further, in 1850, it showed that just Mary and Jane were living alone in the home. In all 3 censuses, however, there's just this one McGinnis family in town. So if Polly did exist, she had to be there. The next clue came in the form of a letter from Conway W. Hillman to James Morgan on September 9th, 1930. He recounts what he saw during the invasion of Carlisle. And he tells how old Polly McGinnis, afterwards Mrs. Woods, was making coffee for the soldiers and slapped General Smith on the back and said, "Don't do it, General. Don't do it as long as one brick remains on top of another." Well, there's some differences between the 2 accounts. They do agree that Polly has a direct conversation with the general and that it involves coffee. However, more important to us is the fact that Mr. Hillman refers to her married name as Woods. That's a big clue when you're trying to find a woman in the 1860s. So I went back and looked at all 5 women who were in the home between 1860 and 1870. The only one's missing is Martha. Where did she go? Did she possibly marry and move out of the McGinnis home? Unfortunately, no, that wasn't the case. Martha McGinnis died on 28th of October, 1863, just a few months from now. It's important to know that she had been the wife of John, the only male in the household. John died on January 13th, 1870, and is buried in Carlisle's old graveyard. John's will bequeaths $5,000 to his daughter, Charlotte R. McGinnis, but with the stipulation that the interest be paid to her for her lifetime and the remainder to be paid to her children. In 1870, Charlotte's still an unmarried 43-year-old, clearly in the realm of spinsterhood. Red-headed spinster, not a good combination. While looking at the Cumberland County probate records and John's will, I also happened to find the wills of both Anne and Jane McGinnis. These wills were on consecutive pages, as both had been recorded on the 14th of May, 1886. Anne had died 2 years previously, February 16, 1884, while her sister Jane had died on May 3, 1886. Both sisters bequeathed their estates, including their home on West Pomfret Street. If you walk over there today, you'll see it as the fabric store. That's where Polly McGinnis lived. But they both bequeathed their estates, including their home on West Pomfret Street, to their niece, Mrs. Charlotte R. Woods. Woods! That was the magic name that Conway Hillman had referred to. I think we have a winner. Before I was going to conclude that Charlotte was indeed our Polly, I needed to verify her information matched the other clues that were given in the poem, The Girls of 63. This unattributed poem was found in the book titled The Memories of Carlisle's Old Graveyard, written by Sarah Woods Parkinson, and was published in 1930. In the 7th stanza of the poem, Polly remembers her uncle, the Commodore of old. Was there a Commodore in Charlotte's life? For this, I would have to climb up into Charlotte's family tree once more. Her father, it turned out, had been married twice. Martha McGinnis had been John's second wife, and they had married on June 28, 1936 in Washington, D.C. At that point, Charlotte was just 9 years old. John's first marriage had occurred May 27, 1824, when he married Miss Charlotte Robeson O'Brien in Philadelphia. She was the second daughter of Commodore Richard O'Brien and Elizabeth Maria Robeson, and she had been born in Algiers. Unfortunately for the family, this Charlotte would die on August 27, 1827, just 9 short days after baby Charlotte was born. Richard O'Brien, grandfather to our Charlotte, was a man who led a very interesting life by all accounts. During the American Revolution, Richard served as a commander in the American naval forces, as well as an adventurer in the privateering exploits of this country. In 1785, however, his ship, the Dauphin, was captured by the Barbary pirates, and he and his crew would be held as slaves for more than 10 years in Algiers. While captive, Richard learned the language and studied the Quran, enabling him to eventually clerk for the Dey, who was the local ruling official in the Ottoman Empire, directly under the Sultan. Upon his release in 1796, Richard remained in Algiers and was appointed Consul General from the United States to Algiers by 3 consecutive presidents. In 1799, he is married to Elizabeth Robeson in Algiers by the Swedish Council, and they will have 4 children, all while in Algiers, and another 4 will be born here in the States after they return in 1805. After his death in a Washington hotel on February 14, 1824, newspapers referred to him as Commodore, occasionally Captain, but mostly it was Commodore. So there was a Commodore in the family tree. Sure, a little literary license was used in making O'Brien her uncle rather than her grandfather, but then nonetheless there's a connection. And with it being through Charlotte's maternal line, there is no other blood relative to Commodore O'Brien in the house. This connection could also explain General Smith's reaction to that single cup of coffee from the Commodore's cup, as the Turkish coffee that Commodore O'Brien had grown accustomed to in Algiers would have been unlike anything most Americans would have experienced. By today's standards, it's stronger and sweeter than espresso. We're talking about a caffeine buzz, a rush of epic proportions, unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. And if the General Smith had drank that, just swigged it back in one gulp, buzz, buzz, buzz. Well, look out, Confederates. Another possible explanation to the General's reaction to that cup of coffee is that it might have been what we refer to today as Irish coffee. Everybody likes a little whiskey in their coffee. The family was decidedly Scotch-Irish, and the idea of fortifying a cup of coffee with just a wee bit of whiskey has a long history. Well, no evidence has yet been found to prove which brew Polly served the General. Either one would have had a definite impact on his attitude. But why did she go by the name of Polly rather than Charlotte? I mean, let's face it, Charlotte is so much prettier of a name. The most common nickname for Charlotte was Lottie, and Polly was more frequently used for Mary. But then as now, there's no hard and fast rules when it comes to nicknames. One possible explanation for them to choose not to call her Charlotte or Lottie was that loss of her mother 9 days after her birth. For John, the loss of the love of his life was catastrophic. To call the baby by her given name, or even the nickname that his wife had used, would have been a constant reminder of his loss. One hint of just how big of a loss Charlotte's death was upon the family did not appear until our own Polly's death on March 9th, 1902. According to multiple obituary accounts, Charlotte Woods had requested one thing, and one thing only, that she be buried in her mother's grave. And they were honoring her request. One account specified that 75 years after her death, her mother's coffin was reopened for this purpose. I can only imagine that Charlotte's deepest desire was to experience the love of her mother and to be wrapped in her mother's arms, even in death. So, our Charlotte's obituary also lets us glimpse into who she was while she was alive. And I'm quoting here from her obituary. She was a woman who possessed many generous impulses, a bright mind, fine conversational skills, and at her best proved a most entertaining and intelligent companion. It does make you wonder, though, what was she like when she wasn't quite at her best? Over the years, there have been several versions of the walking tours through the old graveyard. In 1924, the Carlisle Sentinel published an in-depth walking tour that discussed the legend of Polly McGinnis. Legend says she carried the coffee in her grandfather Commodore O'Brien's favorite cup. Tradition says she carried a big spoon, which she had been using in some domestic matters. History says she carried argument and courage. It's also interesting to note that all the various walking tours throughout the cemetery state quite plainly that Polly McGinnis lies to this day in an unmarked grave, even after her husband Charlotte Wood's death in 1911. In fact, the headstone for Samuel and Charlotte Woods lies to the far edge of the McGinnis family plot, just 3 spots away from where Charlotte's are actually buried. So, you may ask yourself why any of this even matters. Sure, it's a great exercise in genealogical and historical research, but it's more than that. Walk through any cemetery and think about the men and women buried there. Those who were not painted puppets, but real people, real characters. By looking for Polly McGinnis, we are restoring her from fable to fact. At the time of the invasion of Carlisle in June 1863, Polly McGinnis is a 36-year-old spinster with red hair and an Irish temper. It reminds me of the film Quiet Man, where the comment is made, "That red hair is no lie." She lives with her father, stepmother, and 2 spinster aunts. She has social skills and graces, but doesn't always choose to use them. She's a devoted unionist and quick-witted. We are also drawn to believe she had a deep longing for the mother she never knew. Her generosity with her family is also well documented in how she loaned money to relatives to help pay their debts. Altogether, we begin to get to know the real Polly McGinnis, who is easily as remarkable as the legendary one, and should not be forgotten. I'd like to close this speech today with just a few words from the end of Sarah Wood Parkinson's walking tour of Carlisle's old graveyard. You say these are legends. What are legends but framed facts? Frame them and preserve them. If that is not done soon, where will be our history? Gone will be all these old stories. Let us guard our history, not destroy it. Treat it as a sacred trust, not as a specimen. Too often it is treated as such. With a defective lens, the time-made cracks are magnified. Suspicion's weeds are planted. It grows apace. Time passes on. Those who know the truth pass on also. When the next generation turns memory's page, what will they read? To your children and mine, let us pass on our history. That's what matters. Thank you all for coming out today. This has been really wonderful, and it's so great to see you.